And boom, we're on, we're going, we're live, we're making this happen. So, EC, what were we saying now?
Well, one, that it's going to be hard to keep this train on the track with this bunch, but yeah,
Well, what do you
we were
mean?
we were talking about, how sometimes we can get a little afield in nutrition and get maybe a little too in the weeds. And I spent a lot of time in the weeds, circa 2010, through then. And I was, really worried about doing these really precise things. And Boz called me out a few times, and it definitely stuck with me, although I continued on my path of insanity for some time. But there's a few zingers he had, like, are the paleo police going to get you, or is big gluten going to get you? And I was like, oh, Boz just doesn't know. And thankfully, I've come back to a position of slightly more sanity.
Well, I think it's probably more plausible that Boz doesn't know. I think that's probably so we'll have to get into that too. But yeah, that's funny.
Do you remember, since you brought it up, like hindsight being 2020, what were some of the things that you think you were a bit too,
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know, rigid on or whatnot? What are a couple that popped into your head that Boz zinged you about?
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely because I was strict paleo. And of course, I was believing that all carbs were killing us. I didn't have a banana for 3 years, or potatoes.
Those darn
Fruit.
potatoes.
Yeah, I mean, started worrying about fruit, even kind of all the same questions I get with that. Really worried about additives in food, no Diet Cokes or stuff like that. Everything had to be all natural, et cetera. So yeah, just kind of all of the very, very extreme stuff, no dairy, of course, no dairy, no dairy. So
Do
thankfully don't
you,
hold those positions anymore.
and maybe we can dive into some of these topics in more in depth later on, but now looking back, do you think those things, and we're giggling about them, should you not have done them, for lack of a better way to say it, because they weren't sustainable for a long
Mm.
term, or because they didn't move the needle as much as you thought?
Definitely, well, both. But I think I was doing them because I thought, I was killing myself. And really, I think that's the messaging that I'm so against right now. It's all this fear mongering and all of this ideas that are junk science. And sustainability comes with that for sure. Like, it's way easier to keep more foods in your diet than eliminate them. But I think this idea that we're all killing ourselves because we're eating too many bananas, it's like, guys, no, the message is wrong here. That's not
Mm-hmm.
why we have a chronic disease epidemic. And so if I went down that path, and I continue to get questions about that type of stuff, I just want to be a voice of like, no, this is junk science and there's no evidence for this. And in fact, there's evidence for the contrary.
Hmm.
Yeah,
To eat bananas, or to eat grains, or to eat dairy.
and that seems to me the blaming, and we're already off track, but this is why it's a great podcast. The blaming of something that grows from the earth, like a banana or a strawberry, maybe depending upon what you read, you could start to be like, oh yes, I see where this is going. But that almost would be immediately eradicated unless you only hang around with crazy CrossFitters. Okay, so that's a different topic. But if you go out into society and the local restaurant, the water park, my children's sports games, when I see what everyone's eating in the stands, it becomes very obvious that bananas are not the nation's killer. Like
Not
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
very short order. There's probably something else, just putting a dagger in everybody's back, and it's not a strawberry.
Well, I think what's really kind of interesting about this whole line of conversation, number one, side note, let me say that hippie Pat, if it comes from the earth, it's okay. Pat is my favorite Pat.
Right? It's a rare pat.
But I think that it's one of those interesting phenomena of living in the times that we do, that being able to evaluate something and change your mind is so frowned upon almost. It's like, no, you have to have a hard line and it has to be predetermined, and then you have to stick to that no matter what, which isn't real life. And so I think it's really admirable when people can, especially if they want to be a professional and an expert in a given space, come back around on something and say, you know what, actually, maybe I didn't look at that with all of the information that I have now, and I would have reached a different conclusion had I known that information. So I think that's super admirable. And so on that, like, I feel like you have always done such a good job of creating a simplified message for what can be a really complex topic. So how do you balance those two things together? The fact that there can be so much nuance, and yet, like Pat said, at the end of the day, it's probably not some of these nuanced elements that are responsible for the biggest problems that we see from diet and, lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I find with nutrition is that it is wildly complicated at the cellular level, but it's not at the application level. And I think it's true for CrossFit and fitness. We can argue all day about whether or not acidity in the cell is affecting, power production, and whether or not, we need buffers like beta alanine, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we still need to work hard and go faster in our workouts and lift more weight. And so the same thing is true with nutrition. I think it gets wildly complicated when we try to understand what's happening from a physiology perspective. But to make any of those changes, it comes back to what did you have for breakfast and what do you have for lunch? And so that's what I keep trying to bring the conversation back to. It's like, well, what's happening with my insulin response? And it's like, what did you have for breakfast? Because that's how we affect change. And, that's the magic of CrossFit. That's the magic of actually what I'm trying to do in nutrition, is really get people to do behavior change. As much as I love physiology, I don't actually care as much if people understand it. I'd rather see them making the habit change in real life.
So on that, and Pat, I could see you queuing something up, but I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Now that you've been, exclusively focused on your nutrition practice for several years now, do you see more people that need to make like a basic change and get in the ground level on nutrition, versus how many people do you see kind of overcomplicating themselves out of an already sound lifestyle?
That's interesting. You actually said this, Boz. CrossFit is a subculture of a subculture. And so I think within our CrossFitting community, the diehards, I probably have the higher frequency of people spinning themselves out of what was already a basic habit, right? Because now they've latched on to all these kind of fear-mongering things that I did circa 2010. But for mainstream America, it's really basic changes that we need. And I think that's going to be true even at the member level at the CrossFit space. Like the people that are coming in, not necessarily becoming trainers, not necessarily the ones becoming nutrition coaches, they still need the basic changes. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, for both groups, the ones spinning them out and the ones that need to make change, I try to keep bringing back to both the same practices of like, these are kind of some basic tenets that we all need: adequate quality, adequate protein, and caloric control. And until you do that, you're wasting your time nutritionally. And there's not much after that, even at a high level.
Maybe you started talking about it right there with just that little synopsis. But I was going to say, for everyone tuning in, we've got you on because you are the expert. If you had to, I'm sure this could go on for quite some time, but encapsulate your nutritional philosophy, if you will, what is your elevator talk?
Yeah. How many floors do I got? No, but
you got a decent amount. You got a decent amount.
How many floors? So I did this podcast recently that was like the 3 pillars of nutrition that I think are driving at least 90% of the results people want, and at least 90% of the people out there. So the majority of people out there, to get them to at least 90% of the results they want, I think they need 3 things. I think they need adequate quality, I think they need adequate protein, and I think they need caloric control. And then the question is, okay, that's the concepts. It's kind of like, I explained it on the podcast, it's kind of like the 80-20 rule, like spend most of your time on the things that have the biggest payoff. I actually think this is going to be closer to the 90-10 or the 95-5 rule for people. If I get my quality in line, if I get my protein in line and my calories in line, I don't really probably need to worry about much else. Maybe top end athletes, we can get to that. But so those are the concepts, and people are like, cool, yeah, on board, like it. How? That's always then the bridge of like, now how do we actually implement that? And that's where that I have my own methods. That's where I suggest the 800-gram challenge. That's where I suggest lazy macros. And if we need 2 macros, although I really don't love to have to get there. And that's where we get a lot of confusion in the nutrition space, is we spend all the time looking at the methods. It's kind of, again, in CrossFit, it's like, oh my gosh, do I need to do tempo back squats or front squats? And it's like, no, we need you to squat heavy as a principle, right? And so a lot of people get spun up because they keep saying focus on methods without understanding those underlying principles first.
If the how is interesting, but to get people to truly understand those 3 things that you just said, because there's probably a lot of power there, but we just glazed over them rather quickly. Quality, adequate protein, and then caloric control. Yeah. Control. So quality, let's start with that one. Is that just as simple as don't eat processed food? And if so, I guess we could say, what do you mean by processed food? But so when you say quality, how do you define that to your audience?
Yeah, adequate quality. I need the person to get enough of the micronutrients that are required, enough fiber in the diet, and ideally maximize these phytochemicals, like curcumin and turmeric and resveratrol and grapes and all of that stuff.
Resveratrol, of course, resveratrol.
Yes, resveratrol. There's over 8,000 of these, right? So we want to make sure we get them
all the time.
Episode 4.
Episode 4. Oh God. Adequate quality. So I need people to get all of these micronutrients, fiber, and maximize these phytochemicals. And so that comes from whole and processed foods. Great. How people want a number, people want a target. And so that's where I do use my 800-gram challenge for people to eat 800 grams by weight of fruits and vegetables each day. They pick the fruits and veggies, and they can continue to eat whatever else they want. Now, that's not a perfect system for a lot of different ways, but it also is not a perfect system because we can get quality from meat. We can get quality even from grains. But for me, this is a great first step for people to have a good amount of quality in the diet. And from the USDA statistics alone, we've got upwards of 90% of people not eating enough fruits and vegetables. So that's where I start with. Let's establish some quality in the diet. We're going to do it with fruits and veggies, and we're going to hit this kind of target amount.
That sounds like a lot of work. Shouldn't I just have a probiotic drink?
Well, I want to park there on this 800-gram challenge thing because I think there's a couple of really cool pieces in there. This is something broadly that I was interested in because I think it applies to all sorts of health and fitness related topics. But you have something relatively static like the human organism. Like we're not really changing much day to day, week to week, month to month, maybe generationally, sure, but the physiology is pretty set. And yet there's always going to be kind of a consumer need to set yourself apart and try to come up with something that is novel. Mm-hmm. So how do you reconcile that? And I think you've done that really well with this 800-gram challenge. So just kind of an observation there that, you've taken something that I think everybody is intuitively like, yeah, I should do more fruits and veggies, and made that in a palatable kind of package, which is really cool. And then I think there's also a real genius behind that because there's a limited amount of food that people will eat in the single day, week, month, whatever. And if that is offset by trying to get something of a higher quality, then de facto, you're going to jettison some of the junk on the back end, right? So you kind of, I don't know, it's like a sneaky way to get both. That, like I'm looking at your number 3 principle there of caloric control, and that kind of ties into it too. So was that something that consciously you tried to cover your bases with the 800-gram challenge, or is that just something that emerged as kind of a benefit?
I definitely knew that was happening because I actually played with it for 6 months, collecting data on it and establishing rules on it before launching it. I wanted to know what would happen and what are we looking at in terms of calories and diet and outcome. So I knew that was an outcome. The problem is, of course, because we don't take all things in the diet, we still might not have caloric control. And so while most people have like weight loss or weight control or performance effects from it, I have had people gain weight. And that's like, okay, well, we can do the 800-gram challenge and still have a pint of ice cream every night. And that's not going to lead to weight loss. Right. And that's why there are further steps down this. But getting back to kind of your first point, like I'll be the first to tell people, guys, the 800-gram challenge is not magic. I am just telling you to eat fruits and vegetables. Like you've heard this one before. Like I wish I could tell you that it was some new secret thing, and it's not. And my main message in the space is I would rather people get clarity in nutrition and get to the end results. And so as much as I love it as the first road, I am more tied to people seeing the results than I am them using the 800-gram challenge. If they want to do the 799-gram challenge, go for it, or the 600-gram challenge plus not as much ice cream, and that's why I try to speak to other diets as well, so they can understand what's happening with paleo or intermittent fasting and all of that stuff. I will say, I think the one nuance with the 800-gram challenge, well, I don't want to say one nuance, but one, it allows for a lot of flexibility where I think there's been a lot of dogma in the nutrition space. So it kind of takes away some of that. But two, again, you're going to see a lot of influence of CrossFit, no surprise, having a measurable target. If we just say we're going to eat clean today and I'm going to just do better today, or I'm just going to eat more fruits and vegetables, what the heck does that mean? And it's a very slippery slope of what that starts to look like over time. And so this is a way that we can have a meaningful, measurable standard over time to hold yourself accountable to.
Yeah, it's something in there that I thought was so important when it comes to diet or lifestyle, whatever. You seem to have such clarity around, I'm interested in the outcome, and everything that follows is just a tool to help me arrive at that outcome. And if the tool is no longer serving or isn't serving in the way that it was presented initially, let's change the tool. I'm like, that is so I don't know. To me, you seem to exemplify that so well, where you don't get lost in the sauce, so to speak.
And that's CrossFit's influence, to be perfectly honest. And I think that's the beauty of all the teachings that we originally learned and talked and all of my experience there. It's you got to be tied to the outcome, because the science, if you tie yourself to the science and the physiology, you will be wrong. That's going to evolve.
As years go by.
Yeah.
That's going to evolve and that's going to change. And if you tie yourself to where do I have better health markers? Where do I have better performance? Yeah, you're going to be right more times than not.
Circling back to those three, the adequate quality, adequate protein, and then the caloric control. Caloric control is interesting, right? Because many years ago, for sure, and I'm sure it still exists, there almost seemed to be two camps. There's probably more, but there was one camp that was, hey, your body, your weight and whatnot, it's a calories in, calories out deal. And there was another camp that's like, no, it is not. It is a hormonal response to what you're eating, and you can have those wild fluctuations in the calorie as long as you have the proper percentage breakdown of the macronutrients, well, then you're controlling your hormonal response. And that's what drives your body composition, your performance forward or whatnot. All of your experience, all the classes that you've attended, the books you've been in, the whole 9 yards, you've got obviously written down there caloric control. So maybe we've got an idea of where you're going with this, but where have you shaken out on that kind of those two sides?
Yeah. Calories are going to be the driver. I think what gets lost, though, again, is what's happening in mainstream America is that, and this is where the original wording in CrossFit, I think, was so eloquent. I can't even say the word. Wow, that's not elegant at all. He said excessive consumption of refined carbohydrates. Refined carbohydrates, 9 times out of 10, are high in fat as well. And we're getting a ton of calories from that. And that's what's
interesting.
And so hyperinsulinemia, type 2 diabetes, is a disease of energy excess. It's a disease of too many carbs and fat. It turns out typically we're doing that by way of refined carbohydrates, but it carries a lot of fat with it as well. And so it's not, the hormones are involved, but if you reduce calories, you will have better health outcomes. If
somebody's listening to this and interested and it's hitting home, but that not quite sure maybe what you mean by refined carbohydrates, how would you define that?
Yeah.
Or examples?
Anything that comes in a box or a bag that doesn't really have a shelf life, that can kind of be there next year and probably still be safe to eat. Refined carbohydrates. Yes, a product.
And that's where the marketing comes into play. So interesting, right? I mean, my wife and I, we talk about these things with our family, want to get the boys on a good path of eating and all this, and a sustainable path, right? Not make them crazy to one side or crazy to the other. But now what's interesting is they've started to notice things and they ask questions. And we were walking through the aisles of the grocery store the other day, the cereal aisle, I'll be honest. And my youngest son is like, hey, we should get that one. It was Cheerios, because he saw a little heart on the box and he said, it's part of a heart healthy diet and it helps you like avoid heart attacks and stuff. That's awesome. And I was like, I can't even get into this with you right now. I'll connect you with a person smarter than me, but the regular person just walking around, unfortunately, due to some marketing and not the knowledge base that you have, may actually think they're making a good decision that will drive the needle forward, and they pick something off the shelf in the grocery store, and they've sadly just fallen into the trap of marketing, and they're doing quite the opposite due to refined carbohydrates that they're trying to do. So that's why I'm a big fan of having somebody like you on here, so people can start to understand a little bit of the whys and the hows. Like you're saying, you don't need to get down to the molecular level in the cells, but what's actually going on when you consume certain foods and just make better decisions day in and day out, hopefully.
Well, and getting back to this whole idea about calories, I think like so many other topics, people want to glom onto one aspect of that argument and then make it their line in the sand. And what I mean by that is it's always confused me that people want to put themselves in these camps of, well, calories either do or don't matter, and food quality is the only thing or not important at all. It's like, again, this is not a desert island scenario that you were being asked to choose one or the other. Obviously, they're both going to have an impact, and obviously you should try to strike a balance. It's strange to me that somebody is going to sit there with a straight face and argue that, Well, if you eat a sleeve of Oreos every night, as long as that is within your caloric intake, you will be healthy. I don't think anybody can make that argument with a straight face. But on the other hand, I don't think you can make an argument with a straight face saying, well, if I eat 4 pounds of steak and broccoli every day, I will also remain healthy. It's like, well, of course not. The quantity there is ridiculous. And over time, that's going to have negative impact. So yeah, I don't know. It is strange to me that people want to get so down the rabbit hole of one idea and they fail to see that you don't have to choose. And you should consider both metrics.
Well, that begs maybe the question, because why in the world is nutrition such a polarizing topic to begin with, which we had to deal with every now and then if we gave the lecture potentially once a week. But now this is your day in and day out world, EC. This is the path you have chosen. And you've probably had to become much more skilled than either one of us at disarming people, how to broach the subject. So I guess the question is, have you learned at all as to why nutrition is such a hot button, polarizing topic? And then what are some ways people can start to have these conversations without it turning into a fist fight?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer the last one first. I've not seen any war won on the internet, so I don't engage there. And it's kind of funny. I guess I'm sort of a reluctant nutritionist. I actually don't like telling people what to do. I'm not interested in convincing you. I'm not going to send you a study that I think is going to prove anything. Right. I'll tell you what I know. And if you want to listen, great. Otherwise, you can unfollow, turn off, etc. Why is it so polarizing? There is a lot of emotion in it. I think there's a lot of our culture, how we handle food, as well as kind of self-worth, self-love issues, self-esteem around nutrition and what we're eating and what we're told to look like in the media. So I think that also kind of comes into play there, that people have a lot of emotions around it because they've put their self-value in aesthetics. And of course, nutrition plays out in aesthetics.
So kind of full circle on this idea of calories and kind of that idea that this is, there's culture involved in nutrition that can make it such a difficult topic. And you mentioned, norms of aesthetic and things like that as well. So on the back end of that, you talk about adequate protein and caloric count. What I find personally as a challenge, so it's a bit of a selfish question, but I think especially when you have people that are getting into an active lifestyle for the first time and they've done a bunch of like crash diet style stuff in the past, one of the challenges is eating enough and eating enough protein. So what are some of the strategies you have to kind of encourage people to break out of this mindset of, starvation is the only way to salvation. And, it truly is going to be healthier for you in certain circumstances to be eating more than what you're accustomed to.
Yeah. Well, two ways. When I set the adequate protein level, that's at 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. Use your current weight. If you're more than 20 pounds away, then you can use your target weight. For a lot of people that I work with, that's higher than what they're currently doing. And that number came about through a lot of different sources, not to exclude just sustainability and what I find people can actually do. But it also does fall in line with people who are doing resistance training and want to add muscle mass. So, that's a lot of the people that we work with. Now, if you're a professional bodybuilder and you want to go up to 1 gram per pound of body weight, great. But a lot of people aren't there. So that one step is going to have people eating more. Of course, 800 gram challenge, they're going to be eating more fruits and vegetables, although I appreciate the calories are generally low there. But I purposely chose the words caloric control for people like you, because I would even use the word caloric control to mean now we have to eat the right amount for your level, right? I didn't want it to always be minimize calories or eat less calories. I wanted to be eat the appropriate calories for you. And so some people definitely do have to eat more. And this is where there's a lot of confusion in the space, because I'm not sure if you saw the video, I did watch it, Matt Fraser talking about his diet, and people were shocked at the number of calories he ate and shocked at the types of food that he was eating. And it's like, guys, this is it. Or if you saw the stuff about Michael Phelps years ago, it's like, there's no way they can fuel that on broccoli. Right. And so for our higher caloric individuals who need to establish control at a higher level, we're going to do the 800 gram challenge. That's going to be a very small fraction of what they need. And then they're going to have to go on and pick some of these more calorically dense foods. And it is going to be grains and it is going to be processed foods, especially at a kind of a superior athletic level. Yeah.
Interesting. And well, that's actually kind of begs the question then, how different is is your approach when talking about somebody for general health kind of considerations versus somebody who's really trying to push the envelope? You know, what is the difference in your mind? Is there a big difference? You know, how do you tackle that? Because I think, again, there's a lot of people that want to conflate. It's like, well, there's one size fits all. And it doesn't matter if you're trying to be Matt Fraser or if you're just trying to tackle your family history of chronic illness. It's got to be exactly the same thing.
Yeah. I would say those first 3 steps are good all the way through somebody who is not making money off of their sport. So whether or not they're, the middle-aged woman just getting off the couch, or there's somebody like me still doing CrossFit, relatively lean and fit, adequate quality, adequate protein and caloric control. Now, the differences between us will be my protein levels will be different, and also my total calories will be different in how I get there. But I see those people as very, very similar. It's only when we get into the realm where athletics really matter, I'm going to want to know a little bit more about carb to fat ratio, if that's appropriate for your sport. And then guess what? For the Matt Frasers, for the Tias, I want them to try every supplement under the sun that's legal and is not contaminated, because if we get 5% placebo effect, game on. But it's only in that population where a placebo effect matters when we're talking about actually winning a medal. Their health doesn't change because of it. Their performance doesn't really drastically change. It's only to win a medal at an event. So those are the tweaks that I would make. Now, I want to step back to that carb to fat ratio really briefly. What's interesting is when you have people doing a mixed amount of fruits and vegetables, when you establish enough protein in the diet, I don't want to say every time, most of the time, the way they shake out is going to be, I don't know, about 20 to 25% of calories on protein, and then about split between carb and fat. Why? Because doing extreme low carb or low fat is boring. You cut out a lot of sources. And so by default, they end up at this mixed macro middle ground, which should sound very familiar. And guess what? It's really sustainable, and it works for a lot of different activities, including CrossFit. So a lot of times people shake out just by way of having different foods in the diet and having enough protein and fruits and veggies to having a mixed macro diet. And that's where they're going to be fine all the way through until they're making money off their athletic endeavors.
Very cool.
And so it's kind of like my podcast co-host said this, and I like it. It's like, what's the least number of constraints I can put on? Because some things are going to shake out by way of sustainability. And that's why I don't put a ton of rules on the 800 gram challenge. Like, what if I eat 800 grams of mango every day, EC? Fine enough. You'll be sick of it on day 3.
Right. That'll work itself out.
Right. It's going to work itself out. So I'm not going to worry about that rule. And so it's the same thing here. A lot of times we end up at a great macronutrient balance just by way of the fact that we can't eat keto for, ever.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's such a great point too. And super powerful. The older I get, Pat and I talk about this a lot, it's a different mindset that you have when you are first adopting something and you're doing it for the first month or the first year even. But once you get past that first decade and you're starting to stare down the barrel of, okay, I've committed enough to this thing, I'm going to be doing it forever. Maybe not in exactly the same format, but I do think you start to recognize sustainability as a really key driver for no other reason than, you recognize you're going to be doing this longer than you have already, even though you've been doing it a long time. So yeah, that's, I don't know. I just think it's such an unsung hero.
I think that's in general why, and I don't want to just speak ill about all of these and lump them in general, but something that's like the 10, 15, 30-day challenge, like it's this short-term, highly restrictive, whatever it happens to be, and I'll see folks do this all the time, even at my affiliate, and it's, you move the needle, but if you actually stuck with it for 30 days because, you cut a bunch of garbage out, but it was so not manageable in the long run that 2 to 3 weeks later, you're kind of right back where you were. Then you're stuck in this yo-yo effect, compared to taking an honest assessment of where you are, making some changes that, just like you said, are sustainable, and you're not turning your entire world upside down on day 1 so that by day 2 you hate your life and your friends don't want to hang out with you and your family can't stand you and all that kind of stuff. And that's also where I think I enjoy what you put out, EC, because whether people like it or not, there's just a hard dose of just reality, like good health, science, but then mixed with what does, you have to live in the real world. You don't live in a laboratory. You're going to have to deal with going out with your friends or going to the ball game or the movies or whatever it happens to be. And you have to be armed with the knowledge of how to survive in those situations. And I think that's tremendously important. Obviously a big part of the 800 gram challenge is you need to know that you're eating 800 grams, which involves weighing and measuring. And so we just talked about sustainability. Do you see something as actually, weighing and measuring what you're consuming each day at odds with or in line with sustainability?
Yeah. So I actually also do the 800 gram challenge with corporate wellness programs as well. So not just CrossFitters who are a little bit more excited to weigh and measure their food. And that's why I put out there is you can estimate the 800 gram challenge, and that a closed adult fist is about the size of a cup. And so we need about 6 cups a day. The only exception is leafy greens don't weigh that much. So when I'm estimating, and I don't bring my scale with me to the CrossFit Games in Madison, and I'm estimating, I just do 6 fists a day and as many leafy greens as are part of a salad or whatever else I get. I just don't worry about tracking on them, although they do count, technically.
That's my favorite technique though, is when I'm making a smoothie, I'll loosely put the spinach in there. So it looks full. Takes up a lot of volume. I'm like, that's definitely 2 cups, like easy.
Definitely. Yeah.
You're saying that's not the right approach?
That's not the right approach. This doesn't count, Boz. We figured you out. And that's the thing though, about the 800 gram challenge. Like the 800 gram number is not magic. We needed a number that was significant enough to do what Boz was sort of saying earlier. This is already starting to affect quantity, right? And I needed a number that was large enough that would affect quantity, but was also not so huge that nobody could do it. And so the number actually came from a study, but that's where the 800 gram number is. It's not that magic happens at 800. Somebody can be very healthy at 700. Other people will be eating 1,000 regular. It's enough volume that you have to focus on getting in enough quality. And then you still have room for some other stuff. So you definitely can estimate it. You don't need to worry about, is this fist, exactly 138 grams compared to the next fist? It'll all shake out okay.
Weighing and measuring is something I did just so rigorously for so many years that I was dogmatically following the zone, for better or for worse. It had its pros and cons.
Yeah, totally.
But I do circle back to, I've got the scale in the kitchen, and I do circle back to it every now and then just as a sanity check, just to make sure that the calibration of the eye hasn't gone too far one way or the other, because I'm here to tell you, I know which way it always goes. The portions always grow and grow, and then when I break the scale, they grow on one of the two. On the carbs, they always seem to grow. On the protein, I'm like, I'm not getting enough. So it has this.
What about peanut butter? How is that tablespoon of peanut butter going?
Oh man. Yeah, I'm accurate every time for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Just this heaping. That's nothing's falling off. That's good to go. So I've got a question for you based upon a Instagram post you made that I really liked, and I didn't read all the comments, but I would have to assume that it was a storm when I saw it, a good storm. And you mentioned this a second ago with regular athletes, and then the athletes that have a much higher output, and I've maybe worked some different things in there. I wrote down your Instagram post so that I could read it and have you just kind of, there's certainly not an uh-oh thing, but I think it will catch a lot of people off guard, especially ones that have been entrenched in CrossFit for quite some time, and just hearing your why might be really illuminating to them. Okay. Pardon me. So you said, a diet is not, quote unquote, more clean by removing grains, legumes, and dairy. Arguably, a diet is more healthy when they are included. And I think a lot of people would be like, what? I thought that was like one of the essence of I'm just so clean. I removed grains, legumes, and dairy. So how is that statement that arguably it's actually healthier when they are included?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at studies of what happens, these association studies, and I know they're correlation, not causation, we can go into all of that. But when you look at what happens when people who are eating whole grains or legumes or dairy, we generally find better health outcomes. Dairy can be a little bit hit or miss because dairy is how is it interpreted and how is it implied in the diet? But generally, we find that people are better off when they have these foods in their diet. And so part of what that caption was saying is what happens, and this was me, again, 2010, when you go strict paleo and you remove these foods, how we're consuming them in modern diets tends to be ice cream and nachos and, I don't know, refried beans or something like that. So when you clean up your diet, you're actually just cleaning up all the processed stuff. But the non-processed versions of them is again, not what's causing our chronic disease epidemic. It's not the black bean.
Right.
That is just like, oh my God, we need less black beans, or even rice. Like rice is great. We don't need less rice. We might need, I don't know, less rice crackers, covered with tons of brie cheese before dinner and wine, but we don't need less rice. So that was sort of the point of that post.
Yeah. I liked that one a lot.
Well, along the same lines, and this is, I'm really, I don't know, I like to wonk out about kind of philosophy and the culture of things. And so taking that same kind of idea that some of these foods that might be taboo to some people or whatever, and this idea that the highest performers are probably going to be doing things that the average person is not advised to do. How do you kind of advise people, or I guess have them not fixate on some of those elements that might not be right for their situation when there's this obvious game of kind of copycat at the highest level? Meaning I'm an average gym goer. I want to be better. I see a Matt Fraser interview. I see a Tia Claire interview, or a day in the life of video of some CrossFit Games athlete. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's way more food and way more, processed food, et cetera, than I thought. Ergo, if I want to be at that level, I need to do that too. How do you kind of parse through that with an individual who might glom onto the wrong things?
Yeah, I mean, I try to do it, I think, largely through education. I mean, I did a podcast on beta alanine and belief, and I went through the studies about what beta alanine does in performance, and we have maybe a 4 to 6 second improvement on a mile time. And it's like, cool, if you need to win a mile for
by
something. But I'm going to tell you that that's not going to matter in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease or the quality of your life. And so it's like, guys, yeah, this does matter for Matt. For sure. If he gets it, that's great. But it's sort of just trying to put the context around it for them, that what does the research really say? How much of a difference does it make if there is a difference? And is that relevant to you? And I maybe that's how I try to do it, just education of is this relevant to you? And a lot of times on a lot of this stuff, it's no, it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. I could see, I guess a redirect. Because there's lots of things that athletes do that are lifestyle traits that people should be picking up on.
That's a good point.
But I feel like, a lot of time they just get obfuscated by this outlier that people want to see in exchange for these other very sound habits. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I'll use Matt again as an example, but it's one of the things that I love about him as a games champion. What was his hashtag and phrase line? Hard work pays off. It wasn't beta alanine and more subs, that's what's so great about it. Is yes, I'm sure he has some genetic gifts, of course. And then he trained like a madman for years. Right. And look what he did. Tia, I mean, it's the same sort of thing. We know, yes, she has genetic gifts, but she also trains insane amounts. Right. Yep. And so that's what I do like to show for people. It's they did a lot of this through training. And until you're at any sort of level where your training is competitive, all of this other stuff is just little noise that's not going to get you there. They got to be who they are because they trained, those adaptations, even of dropping your mile time, you can do 6 seconds just by doing it, 3 times this week, if you're somewhere in the 10-minute range.
Well, it's a lot easier just to take that, whatever that supplement happens to be, than to do more intervals on the air bike. Nobody wants to go down that route.
Yeah.
It's much easier just to take the same multivitamin that I saw my hero taking and hope for the best.
It comes down to the age-old thing where everybody wants a secret sauce, except for when that secret sauce is you're going to have to put in a lot more time and effort than a secret sauce would imply.
Totally.
I've only got a few more random things for you that I don't know if they'll be short or long answers, but I scratched them down as things of interest. You mentioned this briefly at the beginning, and it's a potential rabbit hole, where you said something along the lines of, your desire was to change people's behavior, or that was an important fact, was changing people's behavior. That if you can crack the code on how to do that, then my hat's off to you, because I am of the opinion that, like you said, I've always said, if we had this magical invisible drone that followed people around for like a month and watched every decision that they made, at the end of that month, it probably wouldn't be mysterious as to why they're falling short of their goals. And if they watched the footage and you watched their face, they'd cringe because they would know, I shouldn't have got that out of the fridge. Yeah, no, I knew that was a bad call, but I did that. Like, that's the night that I chose to watch Netflix instead of workout. Yeah, I got that. Like, it's usually not mysterious. Now, sometimes maybe it's just an honest lack of information. Sure. But there are plenty of people who, you know what you should do, but you do the opposite just because, I don't know, sugar's delicious, the couch is comfortable, whatever it happens to be. And it comes down to actually learning how to change your behavior or a loved one's behavior to improve their life. Do you have any tips or tricks in that sort of realm?
I don't have the secret sauce.
There you go. Shortest answer in history.
If I did, my company would be a lot bigger than it is. But one is, I hate to say this, but that is some of the magic of the 800 gram challenge to stay on brand here, is the idea that I'm not restricting food. Like, let me tell you how you're going to full stop with almost everybody out there, is tell them they can't have beer, wine, chocolate, chips, whatever. So I'm like, okay, we're not doing that. We're just adding foods to the diet. So you try to warm up the palate a little bit, try to do something that's a little bit more sustainable and realistic. So that's part of my messaging. And I've talked about this a lot on a couple other podcasts. We made changes with smoking behaviors, and we made changes with seatbelts. I grew up not wearing seatbelts, as a kid in the back seat.
Amen to that.
Now, both of those are behaviors where we don't see the effect of them necessarily right away, right? It could be something that takes many, many times before we have a negative outcome. Now, it turns out in both of those cases, there was laws around them. And so we made some changes there. But I also just remember there was lots of public service campaigns, I think even around smoking and stuff like that. Like, somehow we made changes there. And so I'm still open to the possibility that nutrition can make a change as well. And whether or not it's a financial focus where we have a little bit more skin in the game that way with our choices and how far our money goes, or whether or not it's regulation, I don't know. But I think there's a way that we can do it, because we've done it with some things that aren't immediate gratification either.
Well, you said how far our money goes, and I'm sure you've heard before, well, hey, that's great, EC, but it's too expensive to eat healthy, and junky food is cheap, and so you're presenting an option to me that's unrealistic and out of reach. I'm sure you've heard that. What's the comeback to that?
Yeah, I go two ways with that. The first is, most of the people, especially that are on my social media group, they're looking at my posts from an iPhone. So it's hard to think that replies to them. But certainly, of course, there's going to be various amounts of budgets. And there's a lot of great options out there with like Walmart. I go to Lidl, is great. Aldi. There's some great chains out there that are very economical, and you can drop your costs significantly so. And then there are going to be times at which there really isn't a lot of money in the budget. And I don't think it's right that we would change our recommendations of what people should eat. I think the problem then is, how do we get money into that community? How do we get accessibility of stores into that community? But I'm not going to say that people, because they have a certain budget, should eat only fast food. I think that's terrible. I think that's horrific. And so we have to figure out, how do we make jobs more accessible, or how do we change what's available in their location, not change the diet recommendations?
Yeah, that's why I'm running for president.
Well, I'll offer my unpopular, outdated opinion on this one, for fear of facing the wrath of the internet. I don't buy it, to be perfectly blunt, and I don't expect anybody to agree with me wholesale on that. But I've gone through periods of time in my life as a young man where my budget was, shall we say, restricted.
Tight.
And I lived on a pretty modest personal income, and I had no problem finding foods that maybe were not as high quality or desirable as what I have access to now, but I made it work. And I think it really is a question more of education and will, more than accessibility in a lot of cases. And I'm sure there's lots of people that disagree with that. That's fine. But I I really think that there's other elements that are more influential than simply, what is my income level?
Oh, totally. I think that's for the most people. And honestly, the prices, like I said, at Walmart, I mean, it's like, this is a really hard argument to make, guys, if you actually go and look at like beans and rice and bananas and apples and potatoes. Like it's a hard argument.
Yeah.
Are there go ahead, boss.
Well, I was just going to say that, coming back to it, it seems like in a field like nutrition that is so complicated, and we talked about, the basic understanding is changing all the time on certain topics. The cultural implications are messy at best. I had this question that I was going to ask you about, like, well, do you think that if you had to choose, communication skills or knowledge of topic are more important? And to me, I'm like, well, I think I know where I land, and I think it's obvious. I think if you can't communicate what you know, you're not going to be able to help too many people. And so that has to be a very important skill set. So that said, and I'll give you a compliment here too, I always feel that you have done an excellent job of harnessing your communication skills. What were some of the things that you did to develop that communication style? And was that conscious, or was that a skill set that you kind of came to the game with to begin?
Well, thank you. I wish it was just natural talent, natural raw talent. I think I had two major influences. The first is my pre-CrossFit days. I did environmental consulting work, and I prepared an expert witness to stand trial for who pays to clean up present day contamination. Wow. And he was great. He was a tough boss. A lot of people thought he was a tough boss. I thought he was great. And he was like, every case comes down to 3 bullet points. The jury, we're trying to convey or convince to 12 people who have never thought about this case that we've spent millions of dollars and years researching. It's going to come down to 3 big points. We need to somehow convince them or convey all of the data that we have or convey all of the knowledge that they have to people that have never thought about this before. And some of my initial drafts to him, he'd be like, what is this, a mystery novel? And so he definitely was the one who kind of set up clarity of, what do you want to say? What are you trying to say? And does somebody who doesn't know what you're talking about, can they follow? So that was kind of some of that initial setup. And then I think CrossFit, with the presentation style, right? I spent a few moments in front of an audience and having to do it in real time. That certainly made me more ready in real time. And I think the combination has really helped me in what I've chosen to do now.
That story of your first or their previous occupation is fantastic.
So one of the cases we had, and I'm not exaggerating, had over 1 million pages of documents to review in a database.
Oh my goodness!
And we had to know to a legally defensible degree what they would say or what they said to convince our case of our client did or did not have legal responsibility. And he still believes it comes down to, 3 bullet points.
Oh, wow. That's trial by fire, but that's incredibly useful for your development as a speaker and just to be concise. I was gonna say, what a crazy exercise, not crazy, what a useful exercise in forced distillation, right?
But think about it. And he wasn't like so dogmatic that it only had to be 3. But I mean, I think even this was some of the early CrossFit days of like the mind works in 3s in terms of some of those rep schemes. But think about it from like an argument point of view, like when people get to more than 3 points, it's hard to remember, right? Mm-hmm. And so it is sort of that, like, what are the big things that they're going to be sitting back there that, wow, this is really hinging on what big factors?
Well, and carrying it forward to something like nutrition, I mean, obviously having the information is one aspect, but if you're talking about somebody that really needs the help, the act is the important thing. And so, that follows. You have all of these different things floating around. They have to be distilled so they can be acted on. And without that, it's just going to be noise in your head. So yeah, that's totally interesting.
Well, EC, I think as we start to wrap this up, I'm curious, are we missing anything? Is there something that we certainly should have gotten across to people that we've neglected to touch on that's of relative importance and would be remiss if we didn't discuss it?
Nothing's jumping forward.
That's because we're fantastic at interviewing people.
I've got one more question.
Go ahead, boss.
And again, I'm going to throw back to something that we talked about a little bit. We touched on this idea of, there's a lot of information out there these days, and I think that's a positive thing on the net. I think that if you go back in time 3, 4, 5, 6 decades, there was really only a few major sources of information that people could access. And whoever had kind of influence over those sources of information could obviously put a lot of their feelings forward, dubiously or otherwise. Nowadays, there's a ton of different information out there. You don't have to take your recommendations based on some government-funded study that obviously has been influenced by a special interest group. You know, as one example, there's a bunch of different independent sources out there. But the obvious problem that creates is now, who do I believe? What is correct? And I think that's where people they get lost in the landscape these days by trying to navigate, okay, who is a trustworthy source? So do you have any advice for people on that front? Like if they are interested in this as a topic, how can they start to separate the noise from the signal?
Yeah. I know I get that question a lot, and it's a hard one because I agree with you. I think it's better to have more voices in this space, and I do think it's a net positive. And I'm part of the noise. I also recognize that as well. I think where I got really turned around is, again, in kind of the 10 years prior, is I would read a lot of blogs, and there's nothing against blogs. I have one, right? So I'm not blog slandering here. But
is that a thing?
But I would read these blogs and they'd be cited, they'd say like studies show. And where I failed initially is I wouldn't track down the primary information. I would kind of understand the blog and not understand the studies. And as I've gotten more advanced in it, a lot of times when I see these blogs now and I go and I look at the study, I'm like, that study does not even mean anything to the topic of interest, or it was done in rats, or it was done in mice. Now, interestingly enough, that's hard for people to discern that. But I think just have the awareness that mainstream media is a better source of getting aware of potential topics. It's not the end all be all. Even if you're well read in blogs or mainstream books, you're probably just scratching the surface on something that somebody's studied for their entire life, if not many decades before, with many other people. So keep that in mind. And that's true of my podcast. That's true of the stuff I put out. I'm not saying that I'm above any of this stuff, but it's just scratching the surface on a lot of these, especially nutrition and science topics that have been studied ad nauseum and are in PubMed to detail. So I think just kind of keeping that perspective. And this is something else that I kind of came up with recently. We'll see how it resonates with people. Be open to the possibility that what we currently have is the best solution. And it's the best solution that was evolved by all of the competing interests to date. Because a lot of times these topics like organic or additives in food or whatever it might be that gets a lot of hot buttons, it's like maybe we're at the best solution of what everybody before us has decided is the best solution. And so maybe try to think about it that way too. Stay open to the possibility that everything's not wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's really smart because there's such a need in I think just life in general for people to see or feel that there's a progress towards something. Even if that something is ill-defined, it's like, well, we have to be moving forward. So yeah, the point that, hey, we may have already found a solution to this problem and it does not need to be, maybe explored further is too harsh, but it doesn't need to be riffed on ad nauseum because the solution it's great. It is a solution.
I think we should even, and this is true with, even something like the 800-gram challenge or whatever diet solution out there is I think we should continually reevaluate them. And are these the best tools? But it might be, it's still the best tool right now, and maybe in 50 years it won't be, and that's okay. We should keep the pressure on to keep developing better, but we don't have to actually change to be better. It could just be keeping the same.
Yeah, or at the very least, it doesn't need to be a total 180, like throw the baby out with the bathwater.
There you go.
Style.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what did you have for lunch in closing?
I actually had, I love telling people what I eat because they're like, you're so random. I did have 2 beef tacos on blue corn tortillas with cheese and tomatoes. And then I made a smoothie with greens and strawberries.
Sounds great.
Okay. My final question, then I'm going to ask you how people can learn more about you if they want to reach out to you. when you do, whenever it happens to be, annually, once a decade, once a week, when you do allow yourself to go off the rails a little bit, what does that look like in EC's world? What does debauchery look like in EC's world?
Well, it's definitely more than once. Would you say once a year? Something crazy
And
like that?
and don't tell me a glass of red wine and a grape, or an almond.
No, I do. I sometimes think I'm like 5 years old. I love sugar. So Peeps, we all know I like Peeps.
Oh, yeah.
I love frosting. Like I'll eat the frosting of cakes and not the cake. Oh yeah. So that for sure.
Have you ever put frosting on a Peep?
Now you're talking. No, I haven't.
Hey, I got this all day long. You see, we're in my wheelhouse now.
That's awesome.
Pat's subject matter expert.
Yeah, exactly. The Peeps are such a random, but it's just amazing. Like, talk about the encapsulation of just crystallized sugar, just a Peep.
Mainline sugar, totally.
Yep. I just got almost distracted for a second. Well, hey, thank you very much for doing this. If people want to learn more about you, more about your company, what you offer, tell us away. How can people find you?
Yeah, OptimizeMeNutrition.com. Same handles on Instagram and Facebook. And then my podcast is The Consistency Project.
A great follow on Instagram, by the way. If you're not doing it, you're missing out. Just daily truth bombs. Don't care if they're popular. I'm a big fan of what's popular, not effective. What's effective and not popular, and that's what you're all about. If it works, this is what I'm going to tell you. So I absolutely love that. EC, thank you very much for making time. Boz, always good to see you as well.
Thank you, guys. Ton of fun.
Yeah, and I will end with this, as we always say. If you're listening to this in audio format, thank you so much. Come on over to the btwb YouTube channel. Post your comments there. Comments for us, comments for EC, future guests, all that good stuff. We read those, and they drive topics for future shows. So to everybody out there in internet land, we appreciate the support, and we will talk to you next time.